People ask me sometimes when I first got scared of working nights, expecting me to say it was some drunk with a gun or a bad wreck on the highway. The truth is, I only started thinking about being afraid after the night out by the Congaree, standing on an old logging road with a deadline in the ground and something alive in the culvert beside it. Before that job, trouble tickets were just numbers on a screen, and the dark was just part of the shift. My name's Tom. I had been doing line work long enough that getting called out at night did not bother me anymore. It was part of the job. If someone's internet or phone dropped in the middle of a storm, or a piece of equipment went down on the edge of nowhere, somebody had to go and lay hands on it. Most of the time, that somebody was me. I was 38 at the time, with 10 years in as a contractor for one of the regional telecom companies. Most of our trouble calls came from town or the suburbs, places where you were never more than a few minutes away from a gas station light or someone's front porch. Every now and then, though, something went wrong out past the subdivisions, where the fiber followed old farm roads and logging cuts that only locals used. Those jobs took longer and paid better, and they were the ones I secretly preferred. Out there, you could work without anyone watching over your shoulder. You parked the truck on the shoulder, pulled on your safety vest and headlamp, and it was just you, the equipment, and whatever the land happened to throw at you. I had run into all kinds of things over the years: feral dogs, drunk landowners, snakes under pedestals, and more wasp nests than I care to remember. None of it ever felt like more than a nuisance. It was just background risk, the kind of thing you accept and manage without thinking about it too much. The ticket that put me out near the Congaree floodplain that night looked routine on paper. We had an outage on a stretch of buried fiber that paralleled an old logging grade south of the main highway. The monitoring system showed a drop in signal strength over a short section, which usually meant a crushed conduit, a bad splice, or somebody with a backhoe who had been where they were not supposed to be. The line cut across the edge of the national park and then continued along a patchwork of private timber and low-lying ground that flooded every few months. The kind of place where the map showed nothing but thin blue streams, contour lines, and a couple of dashed roads. I had driven that general area enough times to know that, once you left the pavement, you were on your own. No streetlights, no houses close by, just pine, hardwood, and swamp. It was late summer, hot even after dark, and the humidity sat on everything like a wet blanket. The air had that heavy, sour smell you get when the water has stood too long in the ditches. When the dispatcher called, I was already in the truck, headed back toward the yard. I glanced at the work order on the screen, saw the GPS coordinates and the note about potential conduit damage near a culvert, and accepted. It was not the first time I had been sent to babysit a line that ran too close to a drainage structure, and I did not expect it to be anything more than a couple of hours of sweat and dirt. According to the map, the line crossed a concrete culvert about half a mile off the main road, where the grade dipped and a drainage channel passed under a small gravel track. That was where the signal loss showed up. I drove until the truck's headlights washed over a shallow depression and the faint outline of a culvert mouth cut into the embankment on my right. There was just enough room to nose the truck off to the side without risking a slide into the ditch. I set the parking brake, killed the radio, and listened for a moment. Out there, away from the highway, the night felt different. No distant traffic, no yard dogs, just insects, frogs, and the steady hum of the truck's engine. I grabbed my hard hat, vest, and tool bag, clipped my headlamp onto the brim, and stepped out. The heat and the smell hit me at the same time. It was the usual swamp mix at first: stagnant water, mud, and vegetation. But underneath that, there was something else, a thicker, rotten note that did not belong to mud or leaves. I stood there for a second with the door still open behind me, breathing it in and trying to place it, before I shut the door and started toward the culvert with my tools in hand. I started the way I always did: find the nearest handhole and see if anything obvious was wrong. The fiber ran in a shallow trench along the shoulder, marked by faded orange posts and a lid half buried under weeds. I scraped the mud off, popped it with a pry bar, and swept my light inside. Mud stains, webs, a couple of spiders, but no broken conduit. I hooked my meter in, got a clean reading on my end, and knew the trouble was somewhere between there and the next access, right where the monitoring system said it would be. From there, I worked my way downhill toward the dip in the road, following the shallow depression of the trench with my headlamp. The smell got worse as I went. By the time I was standing above the culvert, it was right there in the back of my throat, sweet and rotten and thick, like something dead and half-cooked in the summer heat. I had smelled roadkill plenty of times on night calls, but this was heavier than that, like something large had died and nobody had moved it. I told myself there was probably a hog or a deer hung up somewhere in the drainage, out of sight. It was not my job to go crawling around in there to find it. The culvert itself was a round concrete pipe about 4 feet across, pouring black water out into a shallow ditch on one side and taking it in on the other. The logging grade crossed over the top like a little embankment. The fiber conduit had been strapped along the uphill face at some point in the past, with metal brackets, and years of water and rust had done their best to eat it. My work order had a note about possible conduit damage near culvert, and I could see why. One bracket had pulled half loose, and the conduit sagged where it crossed the mouth, just close enough that anything big coming through there in a flood could bang into it. Standing that close, the smell from inside the pipe hit me hard enough that I actually had to turn my head for a second. It felt like I was standing next to the open door of a meat locker that had lost power days ago. I told myself again that it was just something dead in the drainage and got on with it. I knelt near the edge of the road, one boot wedged against the gravel lip, and fired up the reciprocating saw to cut away the old bracket. The blade bit into rusted metal with that harsh, rattling sound they make, the vibration jumping up my arms and into my teeth. The noise bounced around inside the concrete tube like I had stuck my head in a bell. A minute later, the old hardware dropped away into the ditch with a splash. For the next 20 minutes or so, it was just work. I cut a short section of damaged conduit, dry-fitted the replacement, and used the impact driver to put in new anchors higher up on the face. Every time I leaned in toward the pipe, the stink seemed worse. I caught myself breathing through my mouth without meaning to, and kept having to wipe sweat and gnats away from my lips. There were a couple of moments where I thought I heard something shift inside the culvert, a scrape, a hollow little knock, but I wrote it off as water, loose rock, or my imagination playing tricks with the echoes. I was almost finished when the night took a turn. I had the new conduit in place and just needed to clean up the cuts and trim a bit more off one end, so it would sit flush. I picked up the saw again, stepped a little closer to the mouth to get a better angle, and squeezed the trigger. The blade started its hard, buzzing chatter, and the sound boomed down the pipe. This time, something definitely moved in there. At first, it was just a feeling, like the concrete itself shifted under my hands. Then I heard it properly. A heavy, wet scrape from deep inside the culvert, and a slosh of water like something big was turning over. The smell of rot hit me even thicker, riding up out of the pipe in a wave. I let off the trigger and listened, heart thumping a little faster for reasons I could not explain yet. The night went quiet except for the insects and the faint trickle of water. I told myself it was a hog. Hogs will crawl into anything that feels like a tunnel, and I had seen them sleeping in culverts before. I did not love the idea of sharing a pipe with one, but a hog would run if I made enough noise. I thumbed the trigger again, longer this time, and the saw screamed into the darkness. The thing that came out of that culvert was not a hog. It moved forward in a slow, deliberate push, like it was forcing itself through something tight. First, I saw movement in the black water churning around something dark and thick, and then my headlamp caught it properly. A hand came out of the dark, or something close enough to a hand that my brain grabbed the word before it could find another. It was big enough to wrap around my whole head, fingers too long, tipped with black claws that curved down like hooked nails. Wet, patchy fur clung to the back of it in clumps, and underneath that, the skin looked dark and leathery, like cured hide. The hand planted itself on the concrete lip, claws scraping, and then the rest of it followed. A forearm thick as my thigh, matted fur running up toward a shoulder that filled the top of the pipe. Then a head, too high, too broad, eyes catching my lamp, and throwing back a flat, ugly amber glare. It had a muzzle of some kind, but shorter than a dog's, almost pushed in, the skin around the nose black and wet. Its upper lip twitched and lifted, showing teeth that were too long for any normal animal I knew, each one shining with spit. The only word my brain could come up with for it was werewolf, and even that did not feel big enough to cover what I was looking at. I did not remember standing up, but suddenly I was on my feet, the saw still rattling in my hands. The truck was a fair way away. The ditch fell away on either side, and that thing sat square in the only easy path out, half in the pipe and half out of it. It hauled itself up another few inches until its shoulders were clear, and I could see enough of its chest to know that the fur did not cover everything. There were bare patches of dark skin across its ribs and stomach, slick with water or grime, and the smell coming off it was like a slaughterhouse drain. It did not rush me right away. It just stared, breathing hard through its nose. Every exhale made the rotten stink worse. When I shifted my grip on the saw, its eyes flicked down to the tool and then back up to my face. I had the sudden, very clear impression that it did not like the noise. That's probably what drove it out of the culvert in the first place. I do not know how long we stood there like that, man and whatever it was, with the saw screaming between us and the culvert coughing up that stink behind it. But it was long enough for the front of my pants to go warm and wet when my bladder suddenly let go. Up close like that, it was taller than me, even with its shoulders hunched, maybe 6.5 feet, weighing at least 300 pounds. If it had wanted to, it could have gone right through me and the saw. Instead, it hesitated and flinched away from the power tool, head jerking to the side every time I brought it up or held it out in front of me. Its ears, small, triangular things buried in the ruff of fur around its head, flattened back. Something about the way it reacted got through the panic. The saw scared it. Not enough to send it running, but enough to hold it in place. I started to edge sideways, one slow step at a time, keeping the saw out in front of me and the blade running full tilt. At some point, I slid the saw over into my left hand so I could bend down and grab something heavy from the open tool bag with my right. My fingers found a claw hammer. I know how that sounds. Standing there piss-soaked on a logging road with a buzzing saw in one hand and a puny hammer in the other. But don't laugh yet. The ditch yawned black on my left and right, the truck a dim shape just inside the throw of my lamp behind it. I tried walking around the werewolf, slowly, in a wide circle. It matched me step by step, never taking its eyes off me. Every time it shifted as it might lunge, I snapped the saw or the hammer toward it, and it checked itself, lips peeling back in a hiss, staying just out of range. Then it lost its patience. It came at me in a short, explosive burst, claws digging into the gravel, growling, jaws wide open. I thought that was it. I did the only thing I could think to do and shoved the saw straight out with my left hand, the noise screaming between us. At the same time, I swung the hammer wide with my right, more of a desperate slap than a proper swing. The steel face caught it square across the muzzle with a crack that jumped all the way up my arm. The reaction was instant. The werewolf lurched back with a sound that was part bark, part scream, one hand flying to its face. Gravel sprayed under its feet as it scrambled backward a few steps, head whipping side to side, jaws clacking. Some half-panicked voice in the back of my head told me to press it while I had the chance. So before I could talk myself out of it, I drew my arm back and flung the hammer at its head. It was not much of a throw, more reflex than aim, but the hammer still smashed into its cheek. It was not a hard enough hit to break anything on something that size, not even close, but it landed solidly enough to make it jerk back and throw up its other hand, as if I had hit it with something a lot worse. It backed up toward the culvert in a hunched, sideways shuffle, snorting and huffing like a bull that had taken a bad shot to the nose, and for the first time since it crawled out of that pipe, it looked like it was rethinking its choices. Maybe that was all it had ever been. Noise and size and stink and anger, and nobody had ever stood their ground long enough to find out. I could have heard it a lot more with the saw, but that would have meant getting a lot closer. Other than the noise, The saw was useless unless it was already on top of me. In the end, the hammer turned out to be the deciding factor. Some part of me wanted to stand there and see what it would do next, like I was watching it through glass instead of standing 10 yards from it on a dark road. The rest of me understood that this was probably the only clean chance I was going to get to leave that place alive. The werewolf was off balance and bleeding from the snout, one hand to its face, the other hanging low, claws flexing. Its weight had shifted back toward the pipe. For once, it was not blocking the road. I did not waste time. I took 3 quick steps backward, keeping the saw between us until the ditch opened up beside my left foot. Then I ran for the truck. I dropped the saw without meaning to halfway there, heard it clatter and fall silent, and kept going. If the thing decided to come after me, maybe it would stop to investigate the saw and give me a few more seconds to get away. I hit the side of the truck harder than I meant to, grabbed the door handle and almost ripped it off, getting it open. I scrambled inside, slammed the door, and jammed the lock down with my thumb. For a second, I just sat there with my hands on the wheel and my heart trying to kick through my ribs, waiting to feel the whole cab rock forward under a hit that never came. When I finally forced myself to look up, the headlights washed over the dip in the road and the mouth of the culvert. The werewolf was still there, halfway turned toward the pipe, one arm braced on the concrete lip. It looked smaller in the beams, like distance and glass turned it back into something that could possibly exist in the same world as trucks and fiber lines. It lifted its head and looked straight into the lights, eyes burning that same ugly amber. I put the truck in gear and mashed the accelerator. The tires spun on loose gravel before they grabbed, and the whole rig lurched forward. As I climbed out of the dip and the angle changed, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the creature stepping fully back into the culvert, shoulders folding, head ducking into the dark. It was going home. I was getting the hell out of there. I left most of my tools on the side of that road. The bag, the meter, the impact driver, the spare conduit, everything short of what was already in the truck. By the time I hit the county road again, the piss in my jeans had gone cold, and the smell of swamp and rot was trapped in the cab with me, sunk into my clothes and skin. I drove all the way back to the yard with the windows cracked and the radio off, one eye on the mirrors, half expecting to see eyes in the glass or a shape in the beams behind me. I did not go back to finish that job. When I got far enough from the swamp that my hands stopped shaking, I pulled over and called my supervisor. I told him the truth, or enough of it, that I had been forced off the site by a large animal in the culvert, bigger than any hog I had ever seen, and that I was not going to stand there alone in the dark and tempt it a second time. He was quiet for a long moment, then told me to log it as an interrupted job and get myself and the truck back in one piece. Somebody else closed the ticket a few days later. They sent a daylight crew out there, and this part got mentioned more than once in the break room. 2 sheriff's deputies riding along with rifles in the racks. They also noticed the smell, but didn't see any weird animal. In the end, nobody crawled into that pipe or did a thing about the culvert itself. The crew just finished what I'd started, tightened the new brackets, buttoned up the box, tested the line, and ticked it off. The paperwork still said the line had been damaged by shifting concrete and trapped debris, but whatever was actually shifting in that culvert got left alone. Somebody, somewhere up the chain, had decided it was cheaper to pretend the problem stopped at the conduit. The good thing is, I got all my tools back. The guys picked them up and left them in the office for me. Ever since then, whenever a trouble ticket pings near the Congaree after dark, I make sure it ends up on somebody else's screen. I spent most of my working life dealing with the worst kind of people a big city can produce. 30 years in uniform and then in plain clothes will show you everything from petty thieves to men who kill over pocket change. By the time I hit retirement, I had seen enough shootings, stabbings, and overdoses to last me 3 lifetimes. I did my job, I kept my nose clean, and I went home at the end of my shifts. When my pension finally kicked in, I decided I was done with concrete and sirens. I wanted peace and quiet. That is how I ended up on a small piece of land not far from the Congaree. Nothing fancy, just a modest house and enough space to run a small herd of cattle. I did not buy the place because I grew up on a farm or because I had some romantic idea about ranching. I bought it because it was off the main road, the neighbors minded their own business, and the nights were dark enough that you could actually see the stars. The cows came later, when I realized I was not built to sit on a porch all day and do nothing. Raising a handful of beef cattle gave me a reason to get up early, a routine to follow, and something alive to keep an eye on that did not talk back. My setup was simple. I kept a dozen head most of the time, sometimes a few more depending on calves and what I was planning to sell. The main pasture sat behind the house, fenced off with barbed wire and one stretch of field fence where the calves liked to push. There was a small stand of trees along one side that gave the herd shade in the heat, and a low spot that collected water after heavy rain. Beyond my fence line, the land dropped off into thicker timber and swamp, part of that endless tangle of bottomland that runs out toward the national park. I always knew there were hogs, coyotes, and the occasional black bear moving through that cover, but they usually kept their distance. Most nights, nothing happened. The cows grazed, lay down, got up, did what cows do. Crickets and frogs made their racket in the ditches. I would sit in the living room with the windows cracked, listen to the hum of the ceiling fan, and let the quiet soak in. Every once in a while, something would set the herd off. A coyote trotting too close to the fence, a car slowing down on the road, a branch snapping in the woods, but it never lasted long. Cattle know the difference between a nuisance and a real threat. They spook easily, but they settle just as fast when whatever bothered them moves on. The summer this happened, the heat never really broke, even after dark. The days were high 90s, and the nights felt like you were breathing through a wet towel. The smell of the swamp carried farther than usual, heavy and sour, mixing with the dust from the dry parts of the pasture. I remember thinking more than once that month that it felt like the whole county needed a good, hard storm to knock some of the weight out of the air. We got a few scattered showers here and there, enough to keep the grass from burning up, but not enough to cool anything down. If you want to understand what I saw that night, you have to understand that I am not the kind of man who spooks easily. I had walked into dark alleys with worse odds than I care to admit, and I had stood over enough bodies to know what real damage looks like. A coyote in the pasture did not raise my blood pressure. Even the idea of a bear did not bother me much. You can deal with animals. They have patterns. You read their behavior, and you act accordingly. That is what I thought I was dealing with when the herd went crazy just after midnight. I woke up thinking it was thunder at first, the way the hooves were drumming, but there was no storm. The sound coming through the open bedroom window was wrong. Too much noise, too long. No sign of it dying down. Cows will spook and run, but they do not usually keep at it for more than a minute or two, unless something is pushing them. By the time my feet hit the floor, I already knew I was going outside. I pulled on the first pair of pants I could find, slid my feet into my boots without bothering with the laces, and went straight for the rack by the back door. I had carried a gun for so long in the city that going without one felt wrong. Out here, it was just part of the routine. The same 12-gauge I'd bought with my own money and carried to clear, cramped apartments and dark stairwells came with me to the country, along with a tactical flashlight I trusted. I did not have to think about what to grab. I could be out the door in seconds with a light in one hand and a weapon in the other. Old habits do not die. They just move zip codes. The 12-gauge came down into my hands as it had 1,000 times before, smooth and familiar. I thumbed the tube to make sure it was full. Slugs, not birdshot. Then grabbed the flashlight with my other hand and stepped out onto the porch. The heat hit me like a wall. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of dust, manure, and that sour swamp note that drifted up on bad nights. Over it all was the sound of cattle in full panic, bawling, snorting, the clatter of hooves, and the high, frightened bleats of calves. There was no wind, no moon worth mentioning, just a smear of stars and the faint glow from the house behind me. I clicked the light on and started around toward the pasture gate, keeping the shotgun at a low ready, muzzle pointed at the ground in front of me. When I came around the corner of the house and cleared the last little run of fence, I could see the shape of the herd in the beam. They were not scattered and running like they would be if a dog or a hog had gotten in among them. They were packed tight in the middle of the pasture, shoulder to shoulder, heads all pointed outward. The calves were in the center, mostly hidden by bigger bodies. They were not just scared, they were braced. I swept the light along the fence line, looking for whatever had them so wound up. At first I saw nothing but wire, posts, and the dark line of the trees beyond. Then the beam slid across something tall and utterly wrong, standing out in the open, a few yards beyond the ring of cows. For a second, my brain tried to make it into a man. It was on two legs, upright, shoulders hunched, the way a big guy looks when he is trying to bulk himself up and intimidate somebody. But it was too big, too broad through the chest, the arms too long by a good foot. Patchy, dark fur clung to it in places along the shoulders, spine, and thighs, but there were wide stretches where the light caught bare, dark skin, thick and leathery, like old rubber. I could see hands at the ends of those arms, not paws, long fingers tipped with curved black claws that caught little flashes of white in the beam. It was walking back and forth around the herd, not charging, just pacing, taking a few steps one way and then the other, like it was testing for a weak spot in the wall of bodies. I stopped about halfway between the house and the fence and trained the light on it. When the beam found its head, the thing froze. Its eyes flared in the glare, a sick yellow-amber flash, and then it threw an arm up in front of its face, like a man flinching away from a spotlight. The tactical light I carried was made to punch through smoke and dark hallways. Out there in the pasture, it turned that thing's head into a washed-out oval and left the rest of it standing in harsh shadow. I have pointed guns at a lot of people in my time. You learn to read intent in how they stand, how their hands move, how their eyes track you. Whatever this was, it was not some tweaked-out trespasser in a costume. You do not get shoulders like that in a costume, and you do not get legs like that digitigrade and bent wrong unless you were born that way. My brain kept trying to jam it into boxes it understood, but I simply had no word for it, and I didn't need one. Every last brain cell of mine told me that this thing was dangerous and needed to be dealt with. The other part of me took over, the one that had dealt with all sorts of scum for 3 decades, some of whom ended up in jail, some of whom didn't. I moved straight toward the fence at an angle, keeping the light on its face and the shotgun tight into my shoulder. The cows did not move away from me. They were too busy watching the thing beyond them. I closed the gap and rounded the herd until I was about 30 yards out, close enough that I knew the slugs would hit where I put them, but not so close that I would be within easy reach if it decided to close the distance in a hurry. The creature still had its arm up, head turned away from the beam, like a man staring into high beams on a dark road. It shifted its weight from one foot to the other, claws flexing at the ends of those long fingers, clearly not sure whether to press the herd or deal with the light. It was confused and blinded. I was not. I planted my feet and put the flashlight down. Then I brought the bead up to center mass. I did not shout a warning or tell it to drop anything. You do not negotiate with something like that. I fired. The first shot blew the night open. The recoil came back into my shoulder. The muzzle flash lit up the pasture for a split second, and the slug hit it high in the chest or shoulder. I could not tell exactly where, but I saw the impact. The thing snapped backward, like someone had yanked its feet out from under it, arms flying wide, and then it hit the ground on its back with a sound that was half roar, half scream. I racked another round without thinking. It was on the ground, writhing, those long limbs beating at the dirt, mouth open in a howl that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I put the bead on the biggest part of it I could see and fired again. The second slug hit somewhere along its side or hip. Again, I saw the whole body jerk and twist with the impact. By then, the cows were breaking formation and bawling louder than ever, but I could barely hear them over that thing. It rolled onto its side, tried to get its feet under it, and I shot it a third time. That one took it as it was starting to rise. I saw a spray of something dark in the light and heard the change in its voice when the slug hit home. A man, or even a big hog, would have stayed down after that kind of punishment. This thing did not. It staggered up into a crouch, one arm hanging limp, the other clawing at the air, and turned away from the herd. For a second, it was fully outlined in my beam, head still half hidden behind its forearm, blood darkening the patchy fur across its side and shoulder. Then it broke for the tree line in a loping, crooked run. I tracked it with the shotgun and kept firing until the tube ran dry. I know at least one more slug hit. I saw it stumble and pitch forward, catching itself on those long hands before it pushed on. It never went down for good. It crashed into the shadows at the edge of the pasture and was gone. The sound of its passage swallowed up by the trees and the thick brush. I did not go after it. I am not 25 anymore, and I am not stupid. That tree line drops off into rolling ground, deadfall, and swampy pockets, where you can twist an ankle on a clear day if you are not careful. Chasing a wounded animal that size into that mess, in the dark, would not have been brave. It would have been suicide. Instead, I stood there for a moment with the empty gun in my hands, listening to the last of the noise die out. The cows were starting to settle, but they were still huffing and shifting, eyes wide and ears twitching, the way they do when the danger is not fully gone yet. I topped off the tube, went to the fence, and swept the light over the spot where it had gone down. There was blood, a lot of it. Dark patches soaked into the grass and dirt where it had hit the ground the first time. More where it had thrashed and tried to get up. You learn what real blood loss looks like when you work the street, as long as I did. Whatever that thing was, it had taken more than one solid hit and left enough on my soil that if it did not die right away, there was a good chance it had bled out eventually somewhere. I did not sleep much the rest of that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the shotgun leaned within arm's reach, listening to the occasional low call from the pasture and waiting for the cows to stir again. They didn't. When the sun finally came up, I walked the fence line in daylight and checked the herd. The calves were all there. The cows went back to grazing as if it had been a bad dream. The blood on the ground and the churned-up spots where it had gone down were the only proof I had not imagined the whole thing. People sometimes ask me what I think it was. I tell them the truth. I do not know, and I do not much care. I saw enough monsters wearing human faces in the city that I do not waste time trying to name one that wasn't. I know what I saw on two legs in my pasture. I know what I put into it, and I know it never came back. If it ever does, I will do what I did the first time, put more slugs in it until either it stops moving or I do.